Well, good evening and welcome. I'm Lisa Goodman with the St. Charles Communications and Marketing Department, and I'm excited to welcome you tonight to our virtual Doc Talk. Usually we have these events at McMenamins and downtown Bend, but under the current circumstances, we're taking it to the interwebs and bringing it to your home tonight. So we're so glad you could join us this way. In September, we launched Doc Talks, which is a new interactive lecture series that's held every other month. And we feature St. Charles docs talking about hot healthcare topics like sleep hygiene, diet, disease prevention, and more. So here we are tonight to dive into our next topic, dietary sugars, which are among the biggest health threats in America right now. Giving our presentation tonight is Dr. David Guarraia, who is board certified in cardiology and obesity medicine, and who's going to help us better understand the extent to which we're consuming sweetened food and the health problems that can result. But before I introduce Dr. Guarraia, I do want to let you know that we will be taking questions at the end, and here's how it will work. If you're watching on YouTube or Facebook, go ahead and post your questions there. And we have a team who will be reading those questions and posting it in a chat room for me to review. And then I will ask Dr. Guarraia the questions. And I promise to do my best and get to as many as possible in about the 20 minutes we have allotted tonight for Q&A. So Dr. David Guarraia is our Director of Cardiac Rehabilitation at the St. Charles Heart and Lung Center. He completed his graduate degree in pharmacology at the University of Missouri prior to attending medical school, where he continued his research with projects at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland, and at Cornell Medical College. He completed his internal medicine residency at the University of Arizona and his cardiology fellowship at Oregon Health and Science University, where he remained for 10 years after developing the academic medical center's Columbia River Gorge outreach clinics. Dr. Guarraia joined St. Charles Health System in November 2018 and brings with him an interest in preventive cardiology in an attempt to improve long-term outcomes and quality of life with fewer medications or procedures. Prior to the pandemic, he was the principal investigator of an interesting low-carb diet study at St. Charles Bend, and I know he's hopeful that that will resume as soon as we're able to do so. So without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. David Guarraia.
Well, thank you so much. It's an honor and pleasure to be here tonight. I want to thank everybody for attending this kind of unique symposium. So what I'm going to be talking about is diabetes and heart disease. The title of the talk is really the sugar poisoning of America. And, I really think that this is a fascinating topic. Before I begin, I just want to make sure everybody is aware that I have no conflicts of interest. I don't work for the Cattlemen's Association, and I don't work for the fat lobby in America. But I do have an academic interest in maintaining health, and I do have a scientific interest in the cardiovascular well-being of our patients. So it's not that I'm pro-meat or pro-fat or against carbs. I'm really pro-science. So I really think science should dictate what and how we consume food to maintain health and longevity. So a trip down memory lane, 20 years ago in medical school, we learned that there was really 5 traditional cardiovascular risk factors. So stuff that we really needed to pay attention to that increased one's propensity to develop cardiovascular disease. And they're listed for you here. But interestingly, as I matured through medical training, we found that tobacco use had been cut by Americans consistently since the 1950s. And every decade, we saw a decrement in tobacco use. And hypertension has been really well treated by most patients' primary care docs. So both of those issues have gotten better over time. The one that really hasn't has been diabetes, which has been interesting. And this is really where we'll focus our role tonight. So finishing cardiology fellowship, I was most concerned about patients who were dying from cardiovascular disease. How was I going to save these patients and help identify them early on, when we saw them initially in clinic before their event? And an interesting paper came out right around the time of my cardiology fellowship graduation, somewhere around 13 years ago. And really, the paper looked at the number of coronary heart disease risk factors that patients had and what that risk association was to mortality with their first heart attack. And interestingly enough, it's not what you would think. These weren't 2-pack-a-day smokers. They weren't really uncontrolled hypertension. Um, they were overweight. And it's interesting because this is somewhat what we're seeing in COVID. And I'll have another slide of this later in the talk. But overweight, normal cholesterol on initial presentation to the hospital with their heart attack, and diabetes. And what I'll also allude to later in the talk, that the top 3 things we see here, overweight, hypertension, diabetes, these are all interrelated. They're almost the same thing. So the only one that we really can't control here, perhaps, is the tobacco. So when I finished fellowship, the head of the American College of Cardiology was a really famous and smart cardiologist out of Chicago named Kim Williams, a wonderful gentleman. And his push for preventative cardiology was evident that year in our big ACC meeting. And his idea was that to help curb cardiovascular disease, everybody should be on a vegan diet, completely plant-based. So, I'm young, I'm impressionable, and here's this grand poobah of cardiology, so to speak, who is really recommending plant-based diets for all of his patients. And, when you talk to him, what he'll tell you is, patients, they love it. It's not hard to get them to switch to plant-based diets. But I will tell you, leading the charge from OHSU in the Columbia River Gorge, where a lot of my patients were ranchers, it was a pretty tough sell. And their question was, did my red meat consumption cause my heart disease? And they were really adamant in better understanding whether or not the product that they were producing, whether this was harming individuals. So about 2 to 3 years into this foray, I did a sort of a deep dive in the evaluation of red meat consumption. And interestingly enough, Nina Teicholz did as well. She has a fascinating book, really addressing the role of meat and fat. It's called A Big Fat Surprise, wonderful, New York Times bestseller. But in a talk she gave recently, she really went through the data again in a nice, succinct way. And it really speaks to what we see, and that is, as diabetes has risen, the meat consumption in the United States has actually fallen. And when you look at, meat in the cause, not just of heart disease, but in stuff like cancer, where really people are pinning down meat and saying, well, maybe meat's not the best thing. Should we look at other sources of protein aside from meat? Well, let's dig into the data a little bit, because I think it's quite interesting. So when we look at the large clinical trials, they're largely what we call epidemiologic studies. Okay. And when we look at epidemiologic studies, we need to understand something called relative risks. And when there's a very large relative risk, we can be fairly confident that whatever we're doing is probably going to cause harm. However, when the relative risk is less than 2, it's extremely unreliable. We're really out on a limb. You really can't make too many assumptions based on a relative risk less than 2. Okay, so when we looked at smoking, heavy smokers, they had a 15 to 30 times greater risk of dying of lung cancer than never smokers. Take this, that is a very strong association. If you look at COVID, individuals over 75 admitted to the hospital with COVID, 66% increased risk of mortality. That is a very strong association. So compare that now for the relative risk of fresh meat and cancer, 1.17. So the relative risk of eating meat and getting cancer is exceedingly low. And if you look at processed meats, which everybody have been told, cut the processed meats, it's going to cause cancer, 1.18. So really, it's completely negligible. It's anyone's guess. And so when we really dug down and looked at the clinical trials that looked at this, like the polyp prevention trial, this was an NIH-funded study, 2,000 people, 4 years on dietary modification, 8 years follow-up. There's a significant decrease in red meat and processed meat consumption in the group. Okay, and there was no effect on recurrence of cancerous polyps. The relative risk was 1.0, no difference. How about the Women's Health Initiative? What does that say about meat? So this was on nearly 49,000 women average of 8 years on a diet of 20% less red meat consumption. And that was a statistically significant drop in red meat consumption. And over this 8-year period, 49,000 women, no statistical difference between the interventional group and the comparison group. So this question of, diet hard hypothesis, where, is what you're eating, meaning saturated fat and cholesterol, that was a diet hard hypothesis proposed in the 1950s. Is that something that really we need to focus on as the cause of cardiovascular disease? Is saturated fat and cholesterol really the cause of cardiovascular disease? And when we looked at 75,000 men and women in experiments lasting between 1 and 12 years, most were, by the way, government funded. Many of these trials were inpatient trials where they watched specifically what the patients were eating. There was no difference, no effect of saturated fat on cardiovascular mortality or total mortality. So the concern with meat was that, meat is saturated fat, okay, and it's cholesterol. And really in 75,000 patients in these really excellent funded, well-funded, well-prepared trials, there was just no difference in saturated fats on cardiovascular mortality and morbidity, contrary to what you've heard. And so in 2010, there was a meta-analysis that was just fantastic. And that really looked at multiple studies between 5 and 23 years of follow-up, 347,000 patients. And the intake of saturated fat was not associated with increased cardiovascular disease, stroke, or increased disease risks from a heart perspective. And when they considered age, sex, and the study quality, it didn't change the results. So really identifying no significant evidence concluding that dietary saturated fat is associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Okay, so how many of you knew that the low-fat diet is dead? Okay, it is no longer recommended by the American Heart Association. They actually dropped all low-fat language from their website in 2013. Consuming a low-fat diet doesn't lower cardiovascular disease risk. And in fact, what's happened in America since the 1950s, where people started to beat the drum, consume low fat, which really took hold in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, what we found was such low-fat diets, if you take out the fat, you have to substitute something else. And what got substituted was carbohydrates. So such diets actually led to dyslipidemia, hypertriglyceridemia, and low HDL concentrations, which in itself is cardiovascularly dangerous. Okay, so where are we today on this whole low-fat kick? Okay, so that's still around. It still hasn't gone away. It's often preached. And what we've seen in today's population, this is up to 2016, this was a wonderful article and really looked at stuff from clinical data from NHANES, that's the National Health and Nutritional Examination Survey, that was spectacular. And it tried to evaluate who has optimal metabolic health. What percentage of adults have something called optimal metabolic health? So optimal metabolic health means your waistline is normal, your fasting glucose is normal, you have normal blood pressure, triglycerides, you're not taking any medications to affect blood pressure or blood sugar or cholesterol. How many adults have normal values? Okay. And actually, and this is from 22 years of age on, okay? So only 12.2% of Americans are what we consider to be optimally metabolically healthy. And that's from age 20 on. That's, if you look at how many 20-year-olds you think, you would surmise that this should be way higher, only 12.2%. Okay, so we have an obesity problem. Okay, this is the main problem that we see in our clinics, and it's a huge problem we see in cardiovascular medicine. So if fats aren't the problem, okay, and meats aren't increasing our risk for cancer and aren't causing cardiovascular disease, we should probably turn our attention to carbohydrates, okay? So we actually need fats to live. There are something called essential fatty acids, and they're essential for life. If you don't take them in, you will develop a malnutrition disorder and a fat malnutrition disorder, and that's a fatal event. If you don't take in proteins, which are necessary for the building blocks of life, this is amino acids necessary for cell protein and signaling, it's a fatal consequence. Carbohydrates, there is no essential need for a carbohydrate. If you never ate another carbohydrate, you would be just fine. So there is no essential carbs. They're not needed. Okay. And so when we look back in time, starting at the 1700s, you will see that we ate very little sugar consumption. In fact, if you look at refined sugar for Northern European ancestry is about 2,000 years old. And about 500 years ago, they started refining sugar. So sugar introduced into our dietary regimen is a relatively new phenomena, aside from the grains from Mesopotamia. So if you're Mesopotamian descent, that might be 10, 12,000 years ago, but Northern European ancestry, about 2,000 years ago. And so we see it was stable, not much in the diet until about the 1850s. And then it shot up until about in the early 1900s. Then we went to the Great Depression and World Wars. And then you see this exponential rise, starting in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, 90s, when we developed this kick to get on a low-fat dietary regimen. And what's important to note here is that there is an association, Northern European ancestry, between obesity and sugar consumption. And it's robust. Okay. And the reason is now sugar is in everything. And so you have patients come in and they say, well, I drink 1 or 2 sodas a day. Well, an average Sprite has 26 grams of sugar. That's incredible. Unfortunately, in stuff that you think is healthy, like grapefruit juice, apple juice, orange juice, you're getting almost the same as a classic Coca-Cola, or sometimes more in that fruit juice that people come in drinking for urinary tract infection, or they think it's going to boost their energy, or they're taking it as an energy drink. And so there's a lot of unperceived sugar out there that people are taking in, so much so that, when I was seeing a patient in the hospital several weeks ago, I took a picture of his tray, because this is the diabetic in the hospital for a heart attack. Okay. And you see he's got a full glass of orange juice. His coffee is actually sweetened by brown sugar topping. I don't know if you see this brown pouch there on his tray. It's open. Yeah, he's got brown sugar topping in his coffee. He's got orange juice, hash browns, and toast. Okay, this is an entirely carb-laden breakfast. This is a disaster for carbohydrates. This will raise blood sugar tremendously. Okay, so we used to say that when you consume calories, if you burn those calories, you won't gain weight. A calorie in is a calorie out. It's this whole notion that we are a thermodynamic engine. Okay. And when you consume, let's say 500 calories or 1,000 calories in a day, and you go for a run or you're active and you burn 1,000 calories a day, your body weight will remain stable. Well, what it tells us is that, okay, those people who are inactive or have excess calories, therefore they're the ones who are obese. And this actually puts the blame on the patient. What it tells the patient is you're lazy and you're eating too much, when in fact, that is usually not the case. The patients, it's not usually their responsibility for their obesity. We need to, the conceptual model now has shifted to something called the hormonal model of obesity, or hormonal model of weight gain. What happens is we consume excess carbohydrates. Okay, and this carbohydrates is sugar, okay? Whether that's brown rice, which a cup of brown rice, by the way, contains 9 teaspoons of sugar. That's sugar, okay? Whether it's brown rice, white rice, okay, it's sugar. So blood sugar goes up. And what happens when blood sugar goes up? The body needs to respond. So the body responds by releasing the hormone insulin from the pancreas, because excess blood sugar is detrimental, and it needs to be shuttled out of the vascular system, and it needs to be stored in the muscles or the liver. Or if there's excess and the muscles and the liver are full, it gets sent to the fat cells and it gets stored. Okay, why does it get stored? It gets stored for a rainy day, right? Because we didn't used to eat 3 meals a day. We didn't used to have grocery stores, all right? And we used to hunt and gather. So how unsuccessful are we really at hunting and gathering at Fred Meyer's and Safeway? We're very successful there. Okay, so now we eat 3 meals a day. We're told by clinicians to eat 5 or 6 meals a day, or 8 meals a day, constant small meals. So we're constantly snacking. So we constantly have this elevation in blood sugar because we're eating all the sugar. We're constantly secreting insulin, which is taking that sugar out of the blood and storing it as fat. And that is why we're gaining weight. Okay, the insulin prompts the fat cells to accumulate fat to protect us against a fast that is not coming, that's never going to come. Okay. So why is it important to understand carbohydrates in the diet? Well, it is important. Why? Because carbohydrates are the main macronutrients that raise our blood sugar. Fat really doesn't increase our blood sugar. Okay. Protein in low to moderate doses also has a minimal effect on blood sugar. It's the carbs that really cause this rapid uptick in our blood sugar, which will cause a compensatory response with the release of insulin, which is the hormone that causes weight gain. Okay. So why restrict carbohydrates at all? Why don't we just say, okay, let's just eat fewer carbs? How about just cutting back a little on the carbohydrates? So why not 20% of the diet be carbs? Well, this is why. This is the problem. Okay, let me explain this graph. This is very, very interesting. Okay, you see what's circled in purple here. This is important to understand. You actually have to drop your plasma insulin concentration that low. So, below 25, what is that, microunits per mil, before you'll actually start burning fat for fuel. Okay, this is very important to understand. The body doesn't want excess blood sugar. It secretes insulin to deal with excess blood sugar. And until your body has a certain blood sugar level, it doesn't turn off insulin. Okay, and you have to drop insulin below a certain number to manifest the counter-regulatory hormones like glucagon to start burning your fat as fuel. And why are we interested in burning fat for fuel? Well, we're interested in losing weight. So to lose weight, you really have to drop your insulin levels below a certain number. Okay, and so insulin is very key in understanding free fatty acid turnover. And to maximally manifest fat turnover, you have to really drop insulin to very low physiologic plasma concentrations. Okay, so how does this circle back to heart disease? Okay, now this is really where it gets interesting. This is where it gets very, very fascinating for me, because what we see is, and what we've seen over the past 10 years of my clinical practice, is that these poor ranchers were told not to eat meat. Okay, and they were told they were put on a high carbohydrate diet. Why? Because people think Mediterranean diet consists of pasta and risotto and Italian bread. And it's a very nebulous term, this Mediterranean diet. What exactly does that mean? Well, so they come in and they're consuming a high carbohydrate diet. And I almost invariably will check their A1C and they'll be above 5.7. So they're pre-diabetic or diabetic. And by the way, 50%, 50, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but 50% of the adult population in America is pre-diabetic or diabetic. 50% pre-diabetic or diabetic. Okay, what does that mean? Pre-diabetes or diabetes means that you have excess blood sugar. Okay, why do you have excess blood sugar? Well, the sugar in the cells gets so full, there's nowhere for the blood sugar to go. It can't leave the bloodstream and get into the cell. Okay, so the pancreas has to churn out more insulin to force the blood sugar into the cell because the cell is full. So if you look at this arrow here from insulin resistance down to the purple portion where it says compensatory hyperinsulinemia, the reason why that arrow is there is because these people are developing something called insulin resistance. Okay, it's also called carbohydrate intolerance. They're now resistant to the carbs. They can't break down the carbs and the sugar's backing up in the blood because the cells are full. Okay, so what happens in compensatory hyperinsulinemia? very interesting things happen in compensatory hyperinsulinemia. When you have high levels of insulin, okay, insulin is, again, it's the hormone that causes weight gain, okay? So much so that if I have a patient that comes into my clinic and they're newly diagnosed with type 2 diabetes and they're put on insulin as a therapy for diabetes, they will gain 10 or 15 pounds in a week because the hormone insulin will cause weight gain that rapidly. So you see weight gain with compensatory hyperinsulinemia. And all of a sudden, when you see that insulin level start to creep up, what happens is triglycerides skyrocket. So above 150 milligrams per deciliter is abnormal triglycerides. That goes up. And as triglycerides go up, HDL goes down. The good cholesterol goes down in the blood. And if you look at the Framingham trial, what's so interesting about cholesterol modifiers like statin medications, the reason why we started lowering cholesterol is because in the Framingham trial, what that showed was that in individuals with severely elevated LDL, familial dyslipidemia, in LDL greater than 190 milligrams per deciliter, 189 or higher milligrams per deciliter in their blood, LDL concentrations, had familial dyslipidemia, they died sooner from cardiovascular disease. Okay, most of my patients do not have familial dyslipidemia. They have something called atherogenic dyslipidemia. And what that is high triglycerides, low HDL. And when you divide the HDL by your triglycerides, if it's in excess of 4, based on the Framingham trial, that was the most dangerous lipid panel you could have aside from familial dyslipidemia. And that's what people come into our clinics with. Elevated blood sugar, prediabetes, diabetes, atherogenic dyslipidemia, and they've started gaining weight around the middle. Why? Insulin causes us to hold on to what's called abdominal adiposity, or that spare tire. It also promotes endothelial dysfunction. And insulin actually gooses the kidneys to hold on to extra water. So these people gain water weight and they become hyperuricemic also through the kidneys. So they develop gout as a result of the hyperinsulinemia. Because of the weight around the middle, they get systemic inflammation. And this inflammation drives cardiovascular disease. We previously called this syndrome X. So if you look at the arrow down from compensatory hyperinsulinemia, we used to call it syndrome X. It's now called metabolic syndrome. Okay, and it's a function of all that stuff in purple. It's really an inadequate insulin response. The body can no longer produce enough insulin to get a response. And when that happens, ultimately they develop type 2 diabetes. And type 2 diabetes, people have heart attacks at the same rate as people who have already had their first heart attack. So it's a coronary disease risk equivalent. We assume if you have type 2 diabetes, you have coronary disease. It's a risk equivalency. Okay, so what is a ketogenic diet and what does it mean? Well, a ketogenic diet was initially developed in children, and it was initially developed in children because what they found was when you stop consuming sugar and you switch from a carbohydrate-based diet to a high fat-based diet, you can reduce seizures in individuals with epilepsy, childhood epilepsy. Okay, this is fascinating. Sugar in the brain can increase seizure form activity. And when they switch their energy source to fat, they can stop seizing. And so it's been extrapolated from children into adults, and we don't require the intensive fat consumption. In children with epilepsy, it's often a 90% fat-based diet. So that's a true ketogenic diet. A modified ketogenic diet is about 75% of the diet being fat, about 20% protein, so not high protein, somewhere in the moderate to low, and then very low carbohydrates, somewhere around 5% of the diet coming from carbohydrates. And those are usually vegetables. It's not bread, rice, pasta, breakfast cereals, potatoes, and it's really not fruit, except berries. A handful of berries is fine. Okay, so what happens when you go on a high-fat diet? Well, if you look at our cardiovascular disease risk factors that we know, and this is where it really gets interesting as well. If you put someone on a high-fat diet versus a low-carb diet, okay, so I switch that around, high carb versus low carb, okay, you can look at this in red and yellow, okay. So the red is a high carbohydrate, high sugar diet. Okay, so what you see is a lot of the inflammatory markers are turned on, as is abdominal fat mass, as are triglycerides. And when you put people on a high fat diet, the yellow bars. To the right is the percent change. Okay, so if you look at total saturated fat consumption, this is excellent work done by Jeff Volek out of 2008. The total fatty acids, total free fatty acids, saturated fatty acids actually drop when you put people on a high fat diet. Triglycerides dropped as much as 55% on a high fat diet. HDL improves, the good cholesterol goes up. And then this is very counterintuitive because we're consuming a very high fat diet, yet our cholesterol gets better. So why is that? Well, the liver makes about 75 to 85% of our cholesterol. So if you consume a high fat diet, all of a sudden the liver can work easier. It can make less cholesterol. Okay, so our cholesterol typically goes down. And remember, sugar drives insulin, which drives us this atherogenic dyslipidemia, high triglycerides, low HDL. And this is very, very interesting. So you also look at insulin levels, okay, on a high fat diet, the insulin levels drop significantly. So when people who have diabetes, who go on a high fat diet, they often can take less insulin. And that in and of itself will cause weight loss and a drop in systolic blood pressure, fewer medications to be used. Okay, so when you look at body weight and body mass index in kilograms per height and inches meters squared. So if the heavier people get, the more they have to curtail the carbohydrate consumption to get an effect. So people who are very large, who are insulin resistant, can eat fewer carbohydrates than, let's say, the normal body weight individual coming in without metabolic disorder, without prediabetes, diabetes. So everybody is slightly different. And the degree with which people need to curtail their carbohydrates, it's directly related to their body mass index and their degree of endogenous insulin secretion. Okay. This is the ketogenic food pyramid. This is what we give to a lot of our patients. So what we tell them is everything should be recognizable. Okay, this is real whole food. It's not prepackaged. It's not from a grocery store. It's not keto bread from Costco. This is real whole food. This is meats and fish and broccoli, eggs. The one thing I don't love on here necessarily is the bacon, but I don't take that away from patients if they want to consume it. They can. I just tell them to do the regular and a couple slices a day, but everything on here should be recognizable to the patient. Okay, so another question we're commonly given is, what about fasting? How does intermittent fasting work with a ketogenic diet? And what we need to understand is the reason why we have a fat storage system again is to have an energy reserve system in place for when we are fasting, because we used to fast all the time. We used to live in a low carbohydrate state. As hunters and gatherers, the carbs we would get would be from vegetables, okay, in the summer, and fruits, when they were in season, which was pretty rare. Okay, and so when we fast, okay, and we're on a ketogenic diet, the body starts turning over our fat stores, and the liver makes ketones, beta hydroxybutyrate, acetone, acetoacetate, and these are measurable in the blood, in the urine, and we can test and find out who is actually in ketosis. And the interesting thing about ketones is they cross the blood-brain barrier. They can be used as fuel in virtually any organ system of the body. And they're important to understand because this is the energy source that people who are fat burning tap into. Okay. Interestingly enough, they also increase an antioxidant pathway that's not turned on in people who are consuming high carb diets. Okay, so why is this important now? Well, interestingly enough, elevated blood sugar and obesity has been linked to increased mortality in COVID-19. So just under age, above cardiorespiratory issues, is obesity as a risk factor for mortality in COVID-19. This may be one of the reasons why it's decimating certain populations like Detroit and New Orleans, where the rates of obesity, are 40 to 60%, depending on the communities you're looking at. Okay, so we had a clinical trial going here, and we had to shut it down because of COVID. It was run out of the cardiac rehab lab, and like all gyms in America, based on current governmental warnings and governor regulations, it had to be curtailed until gyms reopened. But we were looking at this in patients who have diabetes and cardiovascular disease. And we were taking these patients, putting them on a ketogenic diet and looking at A1C as our primary endpoint. And we're really curious about what the long-term data will show. And we're very interested in restarting the study. And as soon as they open gyms up and our IRB is fully functional here at St. Charles, we're going to reintroduce this clinical trial. Let me back up here. But really what we see is that fasting and ketogenic diets work together to help reduce this inflammatory milieu that causes cardiovascular disease. And the inflammation is principally driven in today's cardiovascular patients by excess blood sugar. And it's not all, but it's the propensity of the patients that we see. And we still have the smokers that'll come in, and we still have patients with extreme premature family history, and we deal with those patients as well. But we really try to focus on addressing whether or not there's a deviation in blood sugar in our patients, and just attempting to reduce the sugar consumption in the average American diet. And when we talk about a high-fat diet, it's kind of a buzzword, and it creates a lot of concern by a lot of people. But I will tell you, when you cut carbohydrates, fat has to go up. I mean, there's only 3 principal macronutrients. So if you cut one of them, the others will have to go up to some degree. And we don't want a high protein diet. We want a moderate protein diet. Why? Because protein higher than moderate levels actually increase blood sugar through a process called gluconeogenesis. It's actually anti-ketogenic. So it's low to moderate protein, 1.5 kgs per body mass index. So it's looking at ideal body mass. It's really this higher fat level that we like. And if somebody doesn't get in their fat quotient for the day, it doesn't mean they need to be chugging MCT oil or trying to find fat anywhere they can. It's just that they eat till they're full and then they stop eating. And the fat really increases satiation. And they're often, the satiety of these patients, they often will come in and say, look, I'm only eating 2 meals a day because I'm full. Should I eat that third meal? The answer is no. That's not necessary. If you're full, you're full. Don't eat more. But we're not afraid of the fat anymore. And I think the important takeaway here is we shouldn't be. So I'm happy to answer questions. Hopefully that wasn't too horrible.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Guarraia. That was very informative and very interesting talk. I can say I learned a lot hearing your presentation, so thank you so much.
Sure.
We have received some questions, and so I will start to go through some of the questions submitted by our viewers.
Great.
So the first one is, Dr. Guarraia, why has it been so historically difficult to connect the dots between sugar intake, diabetes, kidney function, and cardiovascular disease, since it appears so obvious to people who see these patients on a daily basis?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. It started in the 1950s when Eisenhower had his heart attack. The principal team that responded to Eisenhower, by the way, he was a 2-pack-a-day smoker. Not many people knew that, but what really compounded the issue was the fact that individuals who were on his medical team identified what they thought was the culprit in his diet, and they thought it was fat. And the individuals who led the charge at that time were so dogmatic that fat was the cause, they obliterated any arguments or dissent in the medical community. And that could be done in the 50s and 60s. And it created this propensity to look for other potential causes. And when the Framingham trial came out and found that familial dyslipidemia, or high fat in the very high fat levels, meaning in LDL in excess of 180 to 190, was prevalent in patients who had cardiovascular disease, they focused on this. And they had a hammer, which was statins. And it got corrupted. And, the sugar industry loved this idea. And so they started producing food that was delicious, that tastes good, like Snackwell cookies. I don't know if you remember this fad, these cookie craze and these chips, and everything's processed. So it's very easy to prepare and it's very inexpensive. And we kind of lost sight of the fact that really it's the sugar that's the problem. And you have to remember in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, type 2 diabetes was relatively rare. We didn't see that. And, you know, in the 70s, 80s, we didn't really see a huge increase. We didn't see this obesity wave that we're seeing now. So I will say in the last 5 to 10 years, I think we're coming around, but there is absolutely a delay. And it's partly due to the medical system and partly due to the economic system, because there is a huge stake at what's being produced in America. And if you think about how many sugared products are out there, like 90% of the grocery store, so an average grocery store has 600,000 products. 90% of those products are made by 10 companies. Okay, there's an extreme vested interest in to keep the American diet the way it is, not to mention the billions of dollars in pharmaceutical industry creates for treating diabetes and hypertension, which, by the way, diabetes and hypertension are the first two big issues that we see. Reversal of type 2 diabetes is a real phenomenon. So people used to think that type 2 diabetes was a sentence and that was something they have for the rest of their life. It's reversible. Type 2 diabetes is largely reversible. So there's a lot of industry involvement as well.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
So what about honey? Is natural sugar treated differently by the body than processed sugar?
No, unfortunately. I love honey, you know, agave, you know, these are very sweet things, and they're sweet for a reason. That's sugar. And, you know, you have to understand that, you know, if you're lucky enough in nature to find honey, and you were willing to take all the abuse from the bees protecting their hive, you know, I think you could get a little bit of honey and you'd be just fine. But you have to realize that natural sugar, quote unquote, really wasn't prevalent in our diet. And if we were lucky enough to find it, we got a little bit and then it was gone. And carbs are not designed in nature to fill us up. This is a fascinating phenomenon. I mean, we eat protein and we eat fat and we get full. Carbs, not so much. I mean, I could probably sit down and eat an entire pizza, but if you gave me like 2 eggs, I couldn't eat anymore. Okay. And this was because when we found carbohydrates in nature, we were supposed to eat it. Okay. If you found a berry patch, you're supposed to eat all those berries. Why? Because it came around once a year for 3 weeks. And there's nutrients in the berries we weren't getting anywhere else. And this is why a bear can sit in a berry patch for 3 days and never get full, right? But now all the food, 85% of our diet is carbohydrates. So now we're eating all these carbs and they're not filling us up. So you can sit down with your box of Thin Mints or your bag of Doritos and never get full. You know, you can't eat just one. What's that? Advertise you can't eat just. So you can eat a whole thing of Pringles and not stop, because your body doesn't intend you to stop, because carbs were not supposed to fill us up.
Dr. Guarraia, can you go into more detail about how individuals of different levels of obesity need to curtail carbohydrates more or less, and why?
Yeah. So there's 3 classes of obesity: BMIs over 30, between 30 and 35, class 1, 35 to 40, class 2, over 40 is class 3 obesity. And the greater the obesity, typically, the more insulin resistant we are, the more carbohydrate intolerant we are. And so we often use the term carbohydrate intolerant. And I want you to think of that term like lactose intolerance. Okay. So some people can't drink milk and they're lactose intolerant. They drink milk, and let me tell you, you don't want to take a car trip with them. But so people have different levels of insulin resistance and carbohydrate intolerance, just like lactose intolerance. Okay. And so when people consume a certain amount of carbohydrates, some people can burn that and use that as fuel and never gain weight, and their insulin levels really don't go up very much. And some people can eat that cup of brown rice, and it sends their blood sugar skyrocketing, and they can't produce enough insulin to deal with it. So we think that there's a pretty good correlation between body mass index, between body weight and carbohydrate sensitivity. And the bigger the individual, the more they need to likely curtail their carbohydrates to get fat burning. And so let's say in a patient that comes in that wants to lose weight that's not diabetic or pre-diabetic, we often limit them to about 50 grams or less of carbs a day. For people who have metabolic impairment or diabetics, we really try to keep them at 30 grams of carbs a day or less. And to make it simple, we often don't go into the net carbs, which, you know, kind of subtracts fiber from the total carbs, but we just try and say, please try to be under 30 grams of carbs a day, and we should see a change.
Great. So, interesting question. Can a person do a low carb ketogenic diet and intermittent fasting at the same time? Or
Oh
is
yeah.
it unhealthy to do both concurrently?
Yeah, it's fantastic. The ultimate low carb is no carb, right? So that's fasting. Low carb or no carb is a fasting state, and there are many definitions of fasting, and some people do this. They'll eat for an 8 hour window, and then they're fast for 16, or they'll do a 1 day fast or a 3 day fast. And what I try to let patients know is if they take insulin or they're taking medications that can cause hypoglycemia, well, they need to be very careful, and they need to coordinate with the primary care doctor or primary care provider to help coordinate what a fast would look like. But for people not taking a hypoglycemic agent, typically, doing an 18-6 where they fast for 16 hours and they'll eat for an 8 hour window is usually a nice way to get into it. And I will tell you that, people always used to say, oh, I'm so worried about becoming hypoglycemic. Well, let me tell you, that is an extremely rare phenomena, hypoglycemia. If we became hypoglycemic when we fasted for, let's say, 16 hours, there's a good likelihood we would die in our sleep. Okay, because most people sleep 8 to 12 hours a day, and the body doesn't want you to die. And so it would be pretty unusual to become hypoglycemic. So usually this 16-8 period of time to start a fasting thing. And then a lot of our patients, if they plateau on a ketogenic diet, they'll do like a Sunday night to Monday night fast, a 24-hour fast where they drink water and they take in water and they're not taking any other food in. And a lot of times that'll break that plateau and it'll push them into a more weight loss, more fat loss.
Okay, great. So we have a lot of athletes in Central Oregon, a lot of runners, a lot of mountain bikers. So what about carbs and high intensity exercise? I mean, if you're a marathon runner, you get told to carbo load 10 days before the big race. So what does that interplay? If you're a high intensity exerciser, what does that mean for your carb intake? And is it different?
Yeah, absolutely. So generally speaking, people who are in excellent shape can consume higher levels of carbohydrates and not get quite the insulin secretion, the insulin rush that other people would get who are more metabolically deranged, let's say. But I will tell you that a fascinating, maybe we can put a link in the bottom of this talk, fascinating talk on the topic is by a gentleman named Tim Noakes, a physician, MD, PhD, Tim Noakes. The talk is on YouTube. It's called Medical Aspects of Low Carbohydrate Diet. I highly recommend it. And I highly recommend it for athletes because Tim Noakes was the physician who came up with carb loading in the 80s. And I think he feels like he's caused more diabetes in the world in athletes than almost anyone else because and he himself developed diabetes because they were taking intense amounts of carbohydrates. Okay. And their blood sugar would skyrocket, and this causes all this pancreatic secretion of insulin. So now you see a lot of our athletes are switching. And if you look at the Tour de France team that won the Tour de France last year, they did so on a modified ketogenic diet where they were eating ketogenic in training, and then they were replacing supplemented carbs at night during the race to boost their glycogen stores. But what they want is high mitochondrial levels in the blood, in the cells. Mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cells. They produce ATP. So to increase mitochondrial production, you want to increase fat burning. And to do that, you really need to be ketogenic. And so they trained in a ketogenic state and they took keto supplements, which I really don't truly recommend. And they would take in glycogen at night to replete their stores. So probably for high intensity athletes, people doing HIIT training, it's probably reasonable to take in a certain amount of carbohydrates. And what that entails probably depends on the individual, but someplace, in the more complex carbohydrate range, like sweet potato or oats would probably be more reasonable. And I treat every patient like an N of one experiment. People can really play around with this and see how they feel and see how they do on it. And they can watch body weight. There's these there's CGMs now where we can actually monitor our sugar consistently during the day. It tracks to your phone. So in athletes who really want to know, did that watermelon spike my sugar? You'd be surprised what you find out. And some people respond to it and some people don't.
Will you be able to provide a sample keto diet plan? And if so, can you post it on your website?
Sure. I think what we can do is give a list of ketogenic foods, like a food list. Um, what I recommend going with a site I recommend going to is dietdoctor.com, and we can link that. It's a free website where you can get recipes that are either low carb or ketogenic, and they have research on the website. There's a number of talks on the website that can help support individuals going through a ketogenic diet. There is a short phase where people go through sugar withdrawals. It's also called a quote unquote keto flu, where people should take in a little bit more salt and a little bit more water than they normally would. And that's usually associated, it's an actual sugar withdrawal. So the body will flush the system and lose salt. And there's what's called a natriuresis and diuresis, and that can cause muscle cramps. And so for people interested in a ketogenic diet, the dietdoctor.com is a wonderful website that can provide resources if that's something they're interested in. And, they may want to talk to their primary care provider for additional information before they embark on this journey. Or, we're always happy to see people who are interested in doing this.
Great. Well, Dr. Guarraia, thank you so much for a very intriguing and informative presentation this evening. And thank you for taking the time to answer some of our viewers' questions. And we thank you all for joining us tonight. We appreciate you hanging in there with us as we explore new formats to bring you engaging content from St. Charles. And we look forward to seeing all of you again, whether it be in person or online in July for our next presentation. So please follow us on our social media channels for more information and for dates and times for those talks. Thank you so very much, and good night.